Hello. So last time we created a Blazor application, and so this time what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the structure of this application. So we have two projects underneath this one solution. The first project we're going to look at is the server project, and the server project consists of at the very top, this program.cs file. Program.cs is where your web server is created to begin with. And it's actually just a console application. You'll notice that the top line of this is main. It's the starting point of a console application. And what it builds is the render pipeline for your web application. A builder object is created off of the web application class that has a create method for a builder. And you'll notice that from here all the way through to this part here where we build it, what we're doing is we are adding components to the builder's services collection. And this is using a pattern called dependency injection. And basically the idea is we configure our web application by just adding components that we need in our render pipeline. And the order here actually matters. We're not going to get into all the details of building a render pipeline. There's an excellent book on that, and I may go through that and provide a more detailed analysis of this. But for what we need in order to build Blazor applications, just understand that these components can change how your web application behaves. And so we can see at the top we're adding Razor components. Those Razor components we're going to see are the C# front end and server-side components that build our application. And then there's different types of interactivity. There's server interactivity and WebAssembly interactivity, so those are getting added as well. And then because we selected authentication, we have some authentication elements that are being added here. We have our authentication state provider and adding identity. We're going to see when we deal with authentication what this persisting authentication state provider is. And then down here, we're adding cookies as our methodology for storing identity on the client side. And then we get into the type of identity that we picked needs a database to store the data. So it actually builds our database components for us, which is actually one of the nice features of selecting authentication from the start, is we don't have to do this by hand. It gives us a connection string. That connection string is actually stored right now in app settings. And you can see the connection string right here. Often, depending on how you're hosting this connection string will be moved out of here. And actually, because you often need a password and a user ID and password, this connection string actually gets placed into a secrets file and then gets set either with the environmental variables on the server, or you might use a key vault to store this. Right now, this is in the app settings, but often. And it's okay because this is using a trusted connection, which means that we don't have a user ID and password placed in here. But often we have to do a number of things, and we'll discuss that more during different deployment scenarios. But that connection string is in an app setting, so we can reconfigure it. And you'll notice that the app settings has development, and we can add another app settings in here for deployment, and that one can have different, so we can set this up to have different settings based on whether we're running this in development mode, i.e. on a developer's machine, or we're actually deploying this application. For the time being, just know that program.cs gives us one to work with right now because we selected authentication. And we have here we're adding an application DB context. Now this is built using something called Entity Framework, and that application DB context class is actually defined here. We will go over how to use this application DB context to work with a database in a later section. And then it gives us a developer exception page, which gives us more detailed exceptions when we're developing. We can turn that off during deployment so that we don't give all that information to potential hackers. And then here we're bringing in identity. So authentication is the process of making sure that someone says they are who they are. That's basically your login screen. When we bring in identity, we're really talking about authorization, and this part allows us to specify what pages different users and different groups of users can use. So that's what's happening here. You'll notice that it specifies an application user. We notice in this data we have this application user class over here. We can use this so that we can attach additional properties for our user that's associated with our user, and create a profile for our user within this class. So you'll notice that the application user inherits from an identity user. Basically, the identity user class defines all the default things that you need for identity, and then we get to inherit from that, expand on it with this application user class, and then here in our program.cs we are specifying what our application user class is. So you can make that anything you want, but the default scheme works very nicely. And because identity needs to know which database we're working with, you notice that these are both our we have the DB context we're providing to our services is the same as the one that we're providing here. We're just telling it which class we want to use. And then we're saying, please also create a sign-in manager and a default token provider. So this is just this is boilerplate that builds an identity system for us. And then here we are adding an email sender. By default, the application doesn't have the ability to send email, and so it's creating this identity no-op email sender. We'll take a quick look at it. When we go over how to integrate email, we'll need to go into it in more detail. But here's that no-op, and you'll notice that you'll see is that it actually doesn't send an email. It just allows a person to confirm their account on a web page as if they had an email. They do this because you can't make a template do everything for everybody. So this is a shortcut that they kind of create, and we'll see that we're going to have to modify this, and you absolutely have to modify this before you deploy an application, because this is really not meant to be deployed with your application. And then that brings you to this build. So that builds the basic structure of what we need for a Blazor application. And we're going to have to do a lot of work with this to get it to actually be our our full up enterprise level web application in the end. But that gets us started. And once we configure all these services, we ask our builder, which we created up here, to build us an app. And once we have this app, we can do some additional configurations. For example, we can check to see if we're in the development environment when it builds. If it is, it says use WebAssembly debugging and migration endpoints. This makes it easier to debug. If we're not in the development pipeline, we use just a generic error message, and we use HTTPS strict transport security header in order to improve the security. So it's less secure in development and more secure and less easy to debug when it's deployed. And then using HTTPS redirection means that we have to have you have to have a certificate for this website. All modern websites should be using HTTPS redirection, so we definitely want that. Static files allows us to serve up files. So, for example, if you want to be able to upload and download, maybe a user's avatar image, or maybe there's some documents that you want a user to be able to upload or download, you'll need that static files enabled. Anti-forgery tokens is a security measure that you definitely want. And then it has mapping razor components, and again, it's going over this is necessary to enable the different render modes that we have and that we're going to learn about that we have in Blazor. And then finally, for identity, we need this mapping of identity endpoints, and then finally our app runs. So this is actually when our server is up and running and is starting to respond to requests. So basically, if someone types in the domain name for our website, this now at that point in time, that's when the application runs. So that's the program.cs file, and that's really at the heart of the whole application. This is what starts our web server running. Now, all of that then is supported by the rest of this. So we have this data folder, which has our DB context and a definition of our application user. Eventually, we're going to do a number of things with this to add tables and additional models, and we'll use Entity Framework to do that. So we need to learn how to use Entity Framework for this. There's a migration capability that's built into Blazor, which allows us, whenever we make changes that need to be updated in the database, sometimes your database is already deployed. Well, migrations allow you to write code that updates the deployed database without having to take it down. So this is a very handy feature, which we will also learn about. The next folder up is our components, and this is where the front end of our application is presented. So I'm going to run the application at this point so we can see what it looks like, and then we'll have a better idea of what the pages look like when this runs. So we'll give it a second to spool up. So we see this window pop up. This is the console application, which is actually going to start our server. So all that code in program.cs is starting up right now, and once it's running, we'll see this respond. Okay, so now our application is coming to life. You can see there's the location where the server is. and our application starts off. In development mode, you're going to get a localhost domain name. In this case, it shows 7028. And we have right out of the box, we have a pretty nice looking website built. We have a home page. We have a navigation, a left side navigation. We have an about that just goes to Microsoft's Learns page, and this is actually a great place to read more about .NET in general. It's got a counter, which actually is fully interactive. It's actually interactive using WebAssembly, so we'll see what that looks like a little bit. And then we have a weather page. These two are, by the way, when you clicked on provide sample pages, these are the sample pages. So here it goes through, and this is not real weather data. It just randomly generates weather data. You notice it changes every time you refresh the page, but it gives you kind of a view of what a table could look like. And then you'll notice that it's got authentication, a registration, a login, and a authorization required page. We'll go over that in more detail when we get into authorization, but just know that at this stage that authorization is built in because we selected that option. And actually, let me leave that up and running. Or let's run it this way. So if this is what our page is, if we go look at our components, you'll notice that we have these account pages. These account pages are all, this registration, this login page, are contained inside of this account, and there's actually quite a few of these pages. So this is the whole identity authorization framework built up for you right off the bat. You don't have to build that yourself. It's all in here, and they provide those pages scaffold in here, so you can actually go in and modify how the authentication works. And there's a number of places where you do want to do that and where you do need to do that. As I said, that will cover under authentication. What you're going to initially work with the most are the pages folder and the layout folder. And the pages, and so let's first look at the layout folder, and you'll notice that there's this main layout. So you can think of all of these components as a collection of components that nest together and kind of a tree structure in order to build your application. So here's the layout page, and the layout page, if you look at this page, you'll see that we can actually go and I'll hit inspect on this, and if I inspect the top left element here, we see that is it says hackerspace here, navbar brand, and it's an anchor tag. That means it's a link that basically sends you back home. And if I look over here, you'll see that there's a nav menu there's a nav menu component. So some of this stuff looks like HTML and some of this looks like something different. So this nav menu here is actually another Blazor component inside of the main layout component. And if I go over to the main nav menu component and I look in here, I can see that there's this anchor tag here, which is hackerspace. So this anchor tag here corresponds to this anchor tag in the nav menu component, which corresponds to the nav menu component inside of the main layout. So you can see how this is nesting together. If I want to know where this is inside of the nav menu, and the nav menu is inside the main layout. And it also turns out that if I look at app.razor, let's see, actually, yeah, if I look at app.razor, there's this routes component that's inside of app.razor, and inside of routes we see default layout equals type main layout. So if I were to stack these probably in order of how they all stack together, so inside the app, you notice that there's our top level HTML for our document. There's the head block, there's the body, there's a script that brings in Blazor Web.js. So that's actually some JavaScript that the whole application needs to run. We have some style sheets here that we will find in here, app CSS. We will find Bootstrap min CSS here. We'll talk about this style sheet a little bit later. And so just like a normal website, you have some style sheets that are in here. There's a favicon which is located there. You can change that to be and that's the icon that shows up in a web page right there. You can actually change that to be what you want, and you probably should. And then we have a Blazor component called head outlet, and we have a Blazor component called routes. And routes brings in, and here's the definition of the Blazor component from routes. So literally it's taking this code and substituting it in here when it generates your page. And what this one does is, we're going to see how routing works later on, but this routing allows us to switch between different ones of our pages on our site. So this is what allows us to go from one page to the next within our application. It's also in here we see this authorized route view. This sets at the very top level a wrapper around the entire site that allows us to control for authorization and authentication. And within that, we are specifying that render everything with the main layout. There's the main layout. That if you look at the main layout, it's going to contain the nav menu, which is that thing down the left, that's here. It's going to contain this top menu up here, this top row, which right now has just about blank, but you could, for example, if I were to take this and duplicate it and save it and rerun this, let's see, actually, see, now we have two abouts. So you could add more links up here and bring those across here and added links to whatever you wanted along the top just by adding more anchor tags up here. We don't really need two of those, so I'll go ahead and delete that. And then here in an article, you see this @body directive. And then there's an error page. So if I were to say go to blah, which doesn't exist, I believe, let's see, unhandled error. No, this is we'll actually see this when we mess up a piece of code. This is just a cannot be found error from the browser. But if we mess up our code, we will get this unhandled error message. And so this is kind of when you have an unhandled exception in a console application, this is the web equivalent. And so you can actually change how you want those errors to be displayed by modifying that. So that brings us back to this add body directive. What's that? Well, let's look at this page. So we've explained where this comes from, and we've explained where this comes from. That comes from there. This comes from here. Where does this come from? Well, let's take a look. We're on the home page, and if we look at pages, this is the home page. And you'll notice that this has this at page directive. This is the route, and you'll notice that it's just a slash. Let's look at our weather page. Our weather page has /weather. Watch what happens when I go to weather. It goes to /weather. And so this is called the route, and the route is everything that comes after the domain. So the add page directive on these pages specifies what you want this extension to be here to determine where they go to. So that's the routing. So all of our pages which we want to be addressable, that we want to be able to go to the user to go directly to initially, will have an at page directive. And you notice that the home page doesn't have a whole lot. It's just got a page title, and then it's got an H1, and then it says welcome to your new app. Well, if we look here, we go to the home page, it says welcome to your new app. So this content, notice there's not much here, is what shows up here. And that's the whole beauty of this. If we didn't have this kind of structure, if we didn't have this component structure, we would have to copy our nav on every single page. We would have to copy this on every single page for it to look the same. But because of the way this is set up, we don't have to. Our nav menu is defined in this component. Our main layout is defined here. And by breaking this up into components, things that don't need to be repeated don't need to be repeated. Everything's in one place. If we want to change the navigation, we change it here. If we want to change something else in the layout, we change it here. If we want to change something on a particular page, we go to that page. Now, this application is set up with this particular structure, but you can change the structure up. You can actually have multiple layouts. You can you don't have to have the layout be this particular way. If you want top level navigation, you can change and restyle this. A lot of the styling is happening in the app CSS, and so this is where this has been styled. In fact, let's see if we can see, yeah. So a lot of the style is happening there. The other place that the styling is happening is if you look at our nav layout, you notice that some Razor pages have little triangles like some of them don't. So let's look at our main layout, and you'll see that there's a main layout razor.css. So there's a CSS here, and this CSS only applies to main layout. So when we see the main layout, it's styled with this, and we can see, okay, the sidebar is styled this way. We have a nav menu. Well, there's nothing in here for nav menu. Let's go look at nav menu. And so if we look at nav menu, it's Razor CSS. We can see there's all the background colors, all the things that make the nav menu look the way it does. And there's nav item. You notice there's a media query here, and watch what happens. It's already been built so that when we get to a particular side, it switches over to a top navigation menu, and it's actually using a framework called Bootstrap to do this. But there's a lot of stuff that's already built in here. But you can change all of this to be what you want. So if you want to completely change, you don't have to have your application look like this. You can make it be. You can find a style that you want and employ it. And also the icons are specified in here. Their SVG files are just defined directly in here. You can add your own. And so that's the structure of how we have a main layout, a navigation menu, and a page that all combine together along with the app and the routes page in order to make the entire page. So in a sense, all these things are mashed together, and that's what makes your page. So what does it look like building things in this structure? So I'm going to close all these out. So let's just create a very quick page. So I might go in here and then I would add a Razor component. I'm just going to call it demo page. And I usually call my pages, the things that are going to have a page directive page. Notice when you create your page or your Razor component, it doesn't automatically have an @page directive. Since this is going to be a page we're going to go to, we're going to put an @page directive that says, I'm just going to make its route be demo. And we're just going to leave it like that for now. So there's my page. And just doing that, if I run this just like that, you don't see a link to it, but you can type into the URL here, the domain name, and then the route /demo. When I hit enter, you can see it went to my demo page. This is my page. And so I can put whatever I want in here and it'll all show up in this space. Okay, so that's how we can create a page. How can I put a button for it to go to on the nav menu? Well, I open up the nav menu and I can just copy one of these existing nav links, and they have a div. This is for styling purposes, and they give you a component in Blazor called a nav link. So you'll notice if it's something that doesn't look like HTML and it's this different blue color, that's because this is a Blazor component. When it actually renders, it will not render as this. It's going to render as an anchor tag. But they give you a nav link component that sits on top of the HTML component and allows you to build things as Razor components. In fact, it's defined the same way these Razor components are, but it was defined by Microsoft. So here, what do we need? We need an href, i.e. where we want to go, and it's really just asking you what's the route? Where do we want to end up at? So if I put demo, which is the route from my page directive here, and then this span is creating an icon. I'm going to leave the icon that was there. We can actually create different icons, but I'm going to put this in here and then we'll just say demo. So now we've made a new nav link. We'll get into icons later, but for now we'll just use the existing icon. And if I run that, you can see there's my icon. I mean, there's my nav link, I click on that, and it takes me to the demo page. And you can see that when I clicked on that, this href was used to create, to basically just, it was tacked on to the domain name to create the whole URL, which I'm going to, and that's by adding on the page directive. So that's the fundamental workflow for adding pages to your application. And so you can build your website, the basic parts of your website, by creating pages, adding page directives, and then adding a nav link on the nav menu. Now further up here we have this www root folder, and this folder holds the things that ordinarily would be in the same directory as your index page. But in Blazor, everything else in here actually does not get deployed to the website. This is used to generate DLL files, which are deployed, and then the things in the www root folder are also deployed as a folder. And this is where you put things like, if you had an images folder, they would end up here. Your CSS ends up here. If you have JavaScript, you would throw your JavaScript files in here. Anything that you would typically reference in your head block needs to be in this www root folder, and anything that the user would interact with once the site is deployed needs to be in this www root folder. And in our program.cs, when we added this use static files, you'll see here that says files are served from a path specified in the iWeb host environment, web root file path provider, which defaults to www root. So this line is what employs this folder to make files available at runtime. So that's what that is. And let's see, what else do we need to go over? We also have a properties folder, which has our launch settings. These are settings used during development. In fact, if you wondered where the local host number came in, that's where it's specified here. So if you want to change that for some reason, you could come in here. Usually you don't need to. But that's where the settings during development are set here. And let's see, we have this service dependencies. Right now, this is just saying we're using MS SQL and the default connection string. The default database is MS SQL. You can actually change that. Again, in program.cs is what specifies what kind of database we're using. And here it says use SQL Server. If you build this on a Mac and you're using Visual Studio Code, it's going to use SQLite instead of SQL Server. And then our dependencies folders, that's just regular C#. That's where if you wanted to add dependencies to new other libraries, you would add them here. And yeah, connected services. There is a secrets JSONs file. If you right-click on the project, you can view the secrets, manage user secrets. This is a JSON file. Right now there's nothing in here, but if we have, for example, user IDs and passwords, we don't want those in app config. It's a security vulnerability because when you check things into source control, those are sitting there clear text. And yes, your source control can be protected and be private, but if it ever becomes public, someone will see those user ID and passwords. User IDs and passwords belong in your secrets file. Now what that means is that this file is not actually located in the same folder structure as your solution. It's located outside of that. So when you check things into source control, this doesn't get checked in with it. In order to, during deployment, you have to actually manually set these as environmental variables when you do deployment. So when we talk about deployment, we'll get into that a little bit more. But yeah, anything that's a password any user ID that needs to be remain a secret, confidential, or whatever, needs to go into a secrets folder. And it becomes painful because you have to manually copy those around everywhere. Okay, so that's the server side, and then we have the client side. Now the client side is code that will run as WebAssembly on the front end of our application. We'll learn more about that when we get into WebAssembly, but we saw the counter application run. It actually runs interactive mode, interactive auto, and it is actually going to run, let's see, if we want something to be interactive auto or on WebAssembly, we have to put it in this client side. So because this page, actually this is the this counter that runs in, is actually running in the browser, not running on the server. To enable that has to be in this client project. And otherwise, it looks very much the same. It has an app page directive, but it has a render mode that says interactive auto or interactive WebAssembly, and it will behave differently. Now, there's a whole bunch of implications to running on the front end when we start dealing with data. So we're going to learn more about that. But if you're wondering why do we have this additional page and this additional www root, it's because of that interactivity feature. And it's got its own program.cs. It's very sparse. It's got a different set of authorization things that it needs to happen on the front end to work, but they've built it for you. And it really all, there's not much that we're adding here at this point to make this work. A lot of this is done for us automatically. There is a user info class to pass information to the client. You want to be a little careful what goes in here because this will be clear text to the user. So that's why we're not giving the whole application user. And we'll learn more about that when we get into building the front end part of our application. So that's a basic rundown of the structure of a Blazor application. We will learn more about this as we continue on learning about Blazor.